This is the beautiful coast of California. We're in the oceanfront town of La Jolla, just north of San Diego. I'm Stephen Webb, and I read and publish books on fascinating subjects. If you're interested in the subject of ancient Lemuria and how it relates to people on the West Coast and elsewhere today, I've got some perfect beach reading for you. Looking out over the Pacific Ocean here with the sunlight on the water, it seems as though there's a spiritual detective story unfolding here. A few hundred miles off the coast of Southern California, a mystery school called the Garden of Eden existed in the eastern part of the lost continent of Lemuria. In our first episode, we looked at how and why Lemuria was lost and the eventual permanent fate of the culprits, the Luciferians. They were given ample opportunity, many lifetimes, to bend the knee and redeem themselves through service to humanity. But they blew it. Their day is done. Their time is up, and they have no power. The tide has turned toward the light. In episode 1, we looked at the long delay of ages endured by the well-intended 144,000 volunteers, the rescuers from etheric Venus, who got stranded on physical Earth because of their error in discernment of spirits. That error can be transmuted if only they knew. As Earth moves gently onward and upward in vibration during the next 2,000 years, our concern in this mystery is, how will the majority of the 144,000 and many other volunteers know that their original purpose in this assignment on Earth is yet to be fulfilled? If we look at the original purpose of the Garden of Eden on Lemuria, to restore civilization from cavemen to sons and daughters of God, what stands out is that Eden was not an ordinary school as we understand schools. We can take our first clue about the curriculum of Eden from the original volunteer himself, Sanat Kumara. This master was willing to come alone to a darkened planet and to hold the Immaculate Concept, the vision for the restoration of its people for as long as it would take. The remarkable heroism, generosity, and long-suffering willingness of this great master moved many other masters to volunteer to accompany him to Earth. They had no idea what they would face and how long they might be here on a warlike planet targeted by Lucifer. What we see then and now in Sanat Kumara is the highest levels of love, of the formless love of God, I am that I am, personified in an individual Son of God in action. We see the same divine love in Sanat Kumara's spiritual lineage, the volunteers he still calls his sons and daughters: Gautama, Maitreya, Moses, Abraham, Confucius, Krishna, Kuan Yin, Mary, and Jesus, and many others we might describe as saints, east and west. This divine love, when it's in action, appears in individuals as selflessness, surrender, service, and sacrifice. These four behaviors of divine love in action were at the core of the curriculum in the original Garden of Eden, and it's why we can't think of Eden as an ordinary school. It was a university of the Spirit to prepare people of heaven for the density of earth. Maitreya, as the head master of Eden, coached these qualities of love along with the rules about the spiritual fruit, or formless qualities of God, that were the actual curriculum the volunteers needed to master. The learning process was spherical, meaning all the complementary qualities of God needed to be exercised simultaneously. For example, all 12 lines on a clock are essential components and should be considered equally for the clock to be of practical use. Take that two-dimensional example to the third and fourth dimensions, and you have to have it together to be a co-creator with God. And yet, the expansion of spherical learning had to proceed at a pace where each pupil could prove their mastery by testing before proceeding to a more complex outcome. All of this was in alignment with the will of God for the perfect manifestation of a desired alchemy. It was likely that the volunteers already had some awareness that the four core attributes of love, as selflessness, surrender, service, and sacrifice, could be inverted by free will as selfishness, arrogance, aggrandizement, and greed. They knew this as theory, but you can see how dangerous it could be for pupils to speculate or experiment with these inversions when this is exactly what caused the ruin of the fourth root race they came to rescue. And so that free will option, the temptation of curiosity about inverting virtue, was a factor that Maitreya had mastered, but his pupils had not. Therefore, the inversions were understandably off limits, as the fruit on the tree at the center of the garden that could not be indulged by the unprepared. The would-be restorers of civilization were trained in stages of the Eedenic curriculum to visualize and manifest practical solutions for humanity who had lost the foundational arts of agriculture, irrigation, transportation, and housing, among other things. That was the easy part. The difficult part was transmuting the real fears, doubts, suspicions, and rivalries that humanity had accumulated from thousands of years under the cruelty of the fallen angels. The curriculum had to prepare the volunteers for these worldly behaviors, unknown in the etheric, while at the same time providing practical improvements so humanity would gravitate to the light and have the strength to withstand the destructive counterpoise of the fallen warlords. There are, of course, Lemurian parallels with our own recent recorded history. We're going to take a peek inside one basic aspect of the Eedenic curriculum, touching on the lightning flash of divine creativity. This amazing understanding of the practical use of the tree of life resurfaced hundreds of years ago in the Jewish mystical teachings of the Kabbalists. This is Kabbalah, Key to Your Inner Power. It's an introduction to explain how God gives his sons and daughters creative power, with a caveat. The caveat is that advanced creative capability is guarded by our Christ conscience and our elder spiritual brothers and sisters, teachers like Maitreya and Jesus, who have become one with the Word or the Christ. They have no guile, no selfishness, no shadow of turning, and have proven themselves over eons of service to mankind. They are loving, encouraging teachers, but firm about adherence to cosmic law for good reason. In Genesis, Maitreya, or kindness, is described as the Lord God, but he walks through the gardens and is very personal and conversational with Adam on a first-name basis. Even though there is a spiritual hierarchy beneath Maitreya and above him, he is God's chosen representative in authority for that situation. All ascended masters have assigned roles of authority under divine law. They have seen every nuance of self-justification in us, and they will patiently wait in a higher octave until we're ready to pass the tests of discernment that were failed in the Garden of Eden. When the pupil is ready, the teacher appears. So what did the tree of life look like at the center of the Garden of Eden, and why was it forbidden? Let's look at this chart from page 67 in Kabbalah. You can see it's not a literal apple tree. The 10 circles, known as Sphirot in ancient Hebrew, are two-dimensional representations of the vibrational frequencies of the formless divine qualities necessary for the creation of cosmos and of man. In its simplest form, the creative process can be described as a tree in geometric shape, but it can also be superimposed over the body of mankind as a portrait or blueprint of God's virtues within man, as seen on subsequent pages and on Kabbalah's front cover. This is the archetypal man, Adam Kadmon. The lines moving away from the Sphirot at the top, zigzagging to the bottom, represent a divine current, the sequential process of creation, like a lightning flash, beginning in the highest frequencies of formlessness and eventually densifying or decreasing in vibrational frequency to become crystallized as atoms in material form. But there's a vital dynamism hidden within the symmetry. For example, the Sphira, Hesed, meaning love and mercy, on the right, is described as expansive. The divine flash of creation flows through Hesed, or expansive mercy, toward the constrictive Sphira, Gevura, the qualities of justice and judgment. From there, the flash goes to Tiferet, the harmonizing Christ discrimination of compassion, balancing the divine use of mercy and judgment, or when to apply a balance of the spirit of the law or the letter of the law. This depiction of the divine creative process flowing through descending frequencies and expansive and constrictive qualities may seem beyond our comprehension for the moment, but Mrs. Prophet summarizes the Jewish scholar Ze'ev ben Shimon Halevi for a more approachable explanation of the lightning flash of creation. On page 68 of Kabbalah, she describes the divine creative process from the top through the example of an author writing a book. Let's follow the flash from the Sphira Keter at the top. Mrs. Prophet writes, Keter, crown, is the creative principle or desire. The idea itself is conceived in Chokhmah, wisdom, but it is still formless. In Binah, understanding, the idea takes conceptual shape. The author decides, for instance, to write a book rather than a play or a short story that will center on a certain theme. This idea may be held in mind for years, but through da'at, knowledge, it becomes focused. At the point of Hesed, love and mercy, the writer begins an outline of the creative ideas that have been forming in him. Through Gevura, justice and judgment, he continually judges and assesses what to include in the book. He shapes all the creative ideas of Hesed into a practical, finite concept. As the book takes form, its distinctive essence or quality, Tiferet, beauty and compassion, starts to manifest. Netzah, victory, is the point where the book is written down in its entirety. Through Hod, splendor, majesty, the vital forces of the body make the pen move over the paper. Hod also focuses knowledge or language into sentences. Yesod, foundation, organizes the writing and polishes it with a personal style. Malchut, kingdom, is the physical manifestation of the book. This simple example is about the creative process for a book. Sanat Kumara's volunteers had a far more complex challenge: to tend a civilization that was not a pure blank page of God's formless energy to begin with, but one in which most of the qualities of the Sphirot in humanity were already inverted as criminal behavior or made inert by trauma. To the pure of heart and mind, humanity would have appeared as a revolting and unstable mob. And yet the volunteers were aware that the fourth root race were once candidates for the ascension. Because of their curiosity and gullibility, all of Earth's humanity were now victims, corrupted by Nephilim, the ancient Hebrew term for fallen angels, those who fell. This is why Maitreya and our elder brothers and sisters in heaven had and still have a careful, well-proven pathway, preparing us step by step for practical alchemy and to avoid errors induced by outer appearances. When serpent urged Eve to eat the forbidden fruit, to experiment with relative good and evil, Eve and the others understood in theory that evil is an individual's free will choice to invert the use of God's creative energy for unlawful, selfish purposes. Serpent bypassed her theoretical understanding by emotional manipulation of Eve's aspirations to learn about everything in the garden quickly. He used the strength of her enthusiasm against her. There was also the key matter of obedience, which Maitreya established as the guardrail against manipulation. The mystery of obedience is that the holy teacher's instructions, given in love, are to protect the innocent from the consequences of acting with partial knowledge or sudden emotion. The 144,000 volunteers had not completed their training at that time, and Lucifer knew it. Obedience in the student gratefully acknowledges the teacher's protective love without dispute. Serpent's artful temptation was calculated to confuse, to excite, and to usurp or bypass Maitreya's careful, sequential pathway of preparation for everyone in Eden. When Serpent said, "Thou shalt not surely die," he was subtly equivocating over Maitreya's warning. Serpent's inference injected doubt, subtly contradicting Maitreya. Then, when Serpent said, in effect, "If you know good and evil, you be like gods," he was breaking the trust and love between apprentice and master and projecting anarchy as the exciting alternate outcome. Anarchy is the Luciferian endgame, gained by a long series of apparently innocuous manipulations. The 144,000 may have heard Maitreya's warning, but through inexperience didn't register that the consequences of disobedience, for those meant to be the highest example to mankind, was the certain death of their karma-free innocence. With even the slightest taint of selfishness, it will be dangerous for unproven initiates carrying the karma of disobeying a Christed one to have direct access to the pure, creative, civilization-restoring energy of God. Misuse of the lightning flash of divine creativity through well-meaning, partial knowledge would have eventually led in stages to a tyrannical civilization and its eventual dissolution by cosmic law. That was exactly what Sanat Kumara volunteered to prevent. If an individual's creative process is incomplete or imbalanced by selfishness, the lightning flash will create a distorted form. It was why Lucifer and his rebels were not allowed to remain in the etheric octaves. What's not commonly known is that Serpent was not a superior of Eve. Serpent was her spiritual equal in attainment. Eve and the rest of the 144,000 were advanced, pure, and capable of rejecting Serpent's oratory, just as Gautama Buddha resisted his spiritual equal, Mara, under the bo tree in India, and Jesus resisted Satan's 3 temptations in the Judean desert. Eve and the others had a threefold flame, Emmanuel, as we see in the lower figure in the chart. But the guile and animal magnetism of serpent induced excitement and confusion and took advantage of a momentary imbalance in those threefold flames. Once the taint of naively knowing that virtue can be inverted for personal advantage without any thought of the death of etheric innocence, the option to be disobedient and popular became widespread in Eden by word of mouth. The curriculum was preempted, and Sanat Kumara's plan could not continue when the volunteers had chosen to be liabilities. Although they had been manipulated, they chose by free will to be manipulated, rather than guided by their Christ conscience or discernment of spirits. Eve and Adam were archetypally representative of a majority of the 144,000 twin flame volunteers from etheric Venus who failed their preparation in the mystery school of the Garden of Eden and by law had to be expelled. The incomplete training for the volunteers' mission in a dangerous and corrupt environment is still incomplete to this day. The irony in this disaster was that the expulsion of a great majority of the well-intended rescuers of civilization to live and die by the sweat of the brow did leave a pathway open for the restoration of Eden in the distant future. It would be very distant. It appeared to Lucifer that his cunning and serpent's guile had succeeded beyond expectations. Earth would apparently remain under their control indefinitely. And yet, all they had bought with their deception was time. They had merely delayed their final judgment by a few tens of thousands of years. Lucifer dismissed the fact that a remnant of Eden's students were unmoved by the temptation of disobedience and found seclusion in high places far away from Lemuria. When cataclysm destroyed the continent, these loyal few had already carried the ancient wisdom teachings to the Andes and the Himalayas, where they were eventually written down as the Vedas and other holy scriptures. Still, the setbacks in Lemuria and again in Atlantis thousands of years later resulted in complete reboots of Nephilim-controlled civilization through the agency of cataclysm. 2,000 feet high tsunamis tore apart the coastal colonies of Lemuria all around the Pacific. Sanat Kumara and those closest to him retreated to the etheric levels of Earth, and fallen humanity, now including the 144,000 former Venusians, faced thousands of years of short-lived nomadic incarnations before the beginnings of the current known civilization in China and Mesopotamia. The succession of rival Nephilim empires ruled our history and our religions. Throughout the long Via Dolorosa, Maitreya communed at etheric levels with every brave, vulnerable soul who had volunteered to come from heavenly Venus to save Earth, though they may not have been consciously aware of his fatherly presence. Maitreya's comfort for each soul was the certainty of Sanat Kumara's plan. All was not lost, even as the centuries passed. Maitreya established a series of secret mystery schools, much smaller than Eden, in various times and locations during the Piscean Age. Some schools, such as the historic Camelot in post-Roman Britain and Pythagoras' Crotona in southern Italy, were destroyed by betrayers. But Maitreya's persistent inspiration from the etheric levels of Earth to devotees in the physical was remarkable. The schools that remained secret conveyed the ancient wisdom in art, poetry, ballads, sacred music, architecture, and coded writings by trusted initiates. They kept safe houses in India, Persia, Egypt, and Palestine early in the Piscean Age. Then during the Dark Ages after Rome fell, the ancient wisdom migrated westward to Europe, to England, and then North America, always hidden from the Nephilim who ruled church and state. Sanat Kumara's plan looked to our time, the Aquarian Age, for several reasons. At the beginning of Pisces, Jesus prophesied through his disciple John the advent of a new Jerusalem, a holy Jerusalem. No one in the physical at that time could have known that the New Jerusalem meant a blueprint vision of a karma-free community of sons and daughters of God during a future golden age in Aquarius. This was to be the physical and spiritual venue for the 144,000 volunteers and their offspring, redeemed by service, invocation, and creativity on the continent of North America, then unknown to the rest of the world. In terms of timing, Sanat Kumara knew the long arm of cosmic law was set to purge Earth of the Nephilim in the judgment prophesied by Jesus in Revelation, spanning the last decades of Pisces and the early decades of Aquarius. But the Nephilim, with what was left of their once great attainment, also knew that this bridge across the two ages meant their final judgment, that after thousands of squandered incarnations, it would be the actual end of time and opportunity for them. They would attempt to preempt it, as they had done in the Garden of Eden, to buy more time and control of humanity through war. Jesus foresaw a time of trouble at the end of the age of Pisces, such as had never been seen. The threat of something as horrific as global nuclear war in the second half of the 20th century could not have been explained in the vocabulary of Roman times. But prophecy is simply a projection of karmic return without mitigation. Sanat Kumara's plan depended on mitigation, that civilization could be rebooted by the power of informed prayer by the few, or the alchemy of transmutation, rather than the fire of nuclear cataclysm and another dark age. Transmutation means to change something ordinary into a higher form. The plan required a window of opportunity for Maitreya to open a new Garden of Eden in the New Jerusalem, where a loyal remnant would invoke the transmutation of a token portion of world karma. The timing for opening the new mystery school needed to occur during the decades of the Cold War, a time of mutually assured destruction of hundreds of millions by nuclear firestorm and starvation of the survivors. If civilization could survive the period of the judgment without nuclear war at the end of Pisces, the Luciferians' control of civilization would be broken. The following decades would be messy and tense as the remaining Luciferians sought to create a one-world government to control every nation on Earth. With the blessing of cosmic hierarchy, Maitreya, Gautama, Jesus, and a host of heavenly beings drew a small remnant of the people of light together in the second half of the 20th century from around the world. They had been tested for discernment and loyalty in previous lives and again in this life. Then, at the height of the Cold War, Maitreya opened the new mystery school in 1984, far from Lemuria and the old world. It was not a secret, but few noticed. Transmutation of personal and world karma by consistent daily prayer and invocation was not of interest to the evening news. The Cold War ended without global tragedy, and the decades of the judgment passed without becoming centuries of extended Nephilim tyranny. Civilization survived by grace, but most of the 144,000 volunteers and their offspring are still scattered around the world. Most have no conscious recollection of the original mission, and over thousands of incarnations are now accustomed to the world as it is. They have forgotten why they volunteered hundreds of thousands of years ago. The tree of life still stands in the etheric levels of earth, mostly unused by us, because the lightning flash of divine creativity is for those who can be trusted to inherit all of cosmos. How would Maitreya convey the existence of the new mystery school to every son and daughter of God to whom immortality and cosmic creativity is offered? How would they know that their training is still incomplete and their mission on earth is yet to be fulfilled? Let's take a look at Maitreya's own words to his few students as he gathered them, observed their worldly propensities, and tested them in the 1970s, the years before the new mystery school could be opened. He had to be sure who he could trust with a lifetime of devotion as partners with heaven in a grace intended to quietly save civilization from itself and redeem those of the 144,000 who loved God in heaven and in his people. This is return to the mystery school, regaining the Eedenic consciousness. Maitreya's coaching, disciplining, and encouraging words are conveyed in the Holy Spirit through his messenger, Elizabeth Clare Prophet, here in print. The words, concepts, and holy principles could not have been imagined by anyone in our world. Here's an eye-opening example of the Master's encouragement. I am Maitreya. I stand before you in the fullness of my stature. As I confirm myself to your inner eye as the personification of God, I open the door for you to stand upon the platform of life as the personification of the Christ, to be the open door for that self-same realization in all humanity. I have shared my communion cup of love. I have filled your beggar's bowl. And therefore, you are no longer the beggar in life, but the inheritor, the joint heir with the universal Christ. And this example about long-term planning needed to complete the mission. If then the fallen ones, usurping the mind of Christ, plan not for decades, but for centuries, would it not be wise on the part of the avant-garde of light, of Earth's evolutions, to also plan for the centuries, to plan for the hour when those souls, as children of God, will study every word and measured beat of that which has come forth in this dispensation of this 2,000-year cycle? Beloved ones, whether it is the defense of America or of millions of souls destined to ascend from the planetary body, you must think in terms of decades, centuries, and millennia. As mentioned earlier, the Garden of Eden was no ordinary school. Due to Earth's fallen culture during the millennia since Eden, entrance into the new mystery school, known as the Inner Retreat, would be possible only by the right exercise of soul faculties. Maitreya warned his would-be students that during the course of finding their way to him, as he remained unseen, they would encounter counterfeits. He states, "These counterfeits are numerous, and so I say to you that initiation is not the mere touching of your chakras or the passing of a current of energy. It is sending you forth as though blindfolded. And it is saying, now, find your way back to me by vibration. Meditate until you feel my presence as a pulsating cosmic love wisdom, and then direct your course to me, though you see me not. And then Maitreya mentioned observing one's own motive for prayer. He said, I receive the devotions, the very distillations of a soul's offering unto the Most High God. And I was there when Cain made his offering unto the Lord, when Abel made his offering unto the Lord, and the acceptability of the offering is in the purity of the devotion. Some pray to be thought well of men. Some pray that they might receive power and use it against one another. And some pray for the very union of the soul with God, that it might be a gift upon the altar of humanity for the salvation of souls. During the years prior to the opening of Maitreya's new mystery school, the Inner Retreat, hundreds of thousands of people of light, and some of darkness, approached the Ascended Master's teachings with varying levels of interest and curiosity. Not being able to see the Master, but feeling the intensity of his presence radiating from his messenger was part of the trial by fire of the Holy Spirit. The testing by vibration was individualized for each person. Kindness was radiated to see if it was returned. At that time, Maitreya's name was not nearly as familiar to people in the West as Gautama Buddha's name or Jesus the Christ. The reason is that after the expulsion from Eden, Maitreya was hated for thousands of years by his own students and, of course, by the Nephilim. In effect, almost the whole world resented Maitreya as the archetypal authority figure. In his compassion, he understood their anger and confusion. Most of the 144,000 had found themselves in human misery, living short, violent lives in servitude to the courts and wars of the Nephilim. Their plea was, we came here as volunteers. We were the good guys, and this is what we get for trying to help? It was an understandable human response. But beneath the high spiritual office of each of the selected volunteers representing the 144,000 tones of God's love, that meant that only a small remnant of the 144,000 were ready to forgive God in the person of Maitreya and to own the reason they were living in diminished circumstances among the people they came to rescue. And yet, by 1984, the remnant formed, a nucleus out of the many inquirers who came close but were not yet ready. This is Maitreya acknowledging that the requirements for a new Eden were met by the nucleus. So magnificent thou art, O God, within these souls of light. Surrender, sacrifice, and service, so even the test of the 10 will be the fulfillment of the chelas of the will of God upon earth, whereby the nucleus is formed and a community worldwide is wrought. We can do it, and we know it, for we have measured the measure of the hearts of our chelas. We know that there is a unison, there is a consonance, there is a merging of a body of light bearers upon earth whose hearts are in harmony with our vibration, emanating from this point of light in the heart of the messengers ascended and unascended. Therefore we see that lines of force can be drawn, and when they are tested, they are taught. There is strength, there is resilience born of the fiery trial, and there is not that reserve and rigidity that marks the fallen ones or those on the lesser path of self-fulfillment. There is strength and resilience, For everyone upon the planetary body who is one in the harmony of this consonance of eternal life, there is the contact with the great white brotherhood. There is the strengthening of the bond. There is the world body. There is that mighty framework of life to which all souls of light may rise. Of all the literature you might read in this life, Return to the Mystery School offers the pleasure of the etheric company of Maitreya in his words and between his words. It's like a fireside audience with a fatherly presence of great intelligence, compassion, and understanding. He's aware of what your soul has endured over these many lifetimes and offers comfort, reassurance, and your old assignment renewed. What happened when the new mystery school, the inner retreat, was announced by Jesus as a reality in our physical octave? The training and the work on behalf of civilization began again in earnest. In the original Eden, the mystery school was in the lower etheric levels of Earth, and Maitreya walked and talked with the students. In the new mystery school, the setting is in the physical, though much of the actual soul training happens in the unseen etheric. Self-observation of one's emotional, mental, and physical reactions to unexpected testing is a basic, ongoing part of the curriculum. That's why it's known as the inner retreat. For those successive generations who follow the pioneers of the inner retreat, Maitreya's training for his students is recorded in print and video, again, within his words, between his words, and in his presence. This is Teachings from the Mystery School, the Maitreya Discourses. These are the Master's guidelines to the spoken and unspoken curriculum. Maitreya was Jesus' teacher. Whenever Jesus mentioned "my Father" in the New Testament, he was speaking about being in the unseen presence of Maitreya and speaking for Maitreya, as above in the etheric, so below in the physical. Jesus represented the divine authority for the Garden of Eden to those of the 144,000 who had incarnated in Palestine for the new dispensation of Pisces. How was Jesus able to do this? By perpetual attunement with Maitreya's vibration of love wisdom. This attunement had been tested for many incarnations before Jesus' Palestinian mission. What happened to Jesus between the ages of 12 and 29 before he began his mission in Palestine? Jesus, at age 12, told his biological parents, Mary and Joseph, after they found him talking with the learned men in the temple, "Don't you know? I must be about my Father's business." Joseph and Mary were understandably astonished, but Jesus had already felt the vibration of Maitreya, and during his teens, Jesus responded to Maitreya's inner call, "Come and find me." That meant some serious travel for a teen, from Palestine through Persia and India to Kashmir, Nepal, Tibet, and back again. Jesus met Maitreya along the way many times over those 16 years in the person of other people who instructed him by their actions and reactions. Being perpetually in Maitreya's presence allowed an inner understanding to emerge from every situation as to how the Son of God comforts and guides his own. And so it's fitting that in the first chapter of Teachings from the Mystery School, Jesus speaks for Maitreya to us again. The chapter heading tells us what the whole purpose of the mystery school is. Christhood, present attainment, and the goal. Jesus reached the goal long ago and is saying, you are here in your present karmic situation. Look up and see the way for you to go. He urges us to self-assessment, to see the gap between what could be and where we are in this moment. Jesus says, know then that my mission going before him, even as John the Baptist went before me, was to clear the way for the coming of this universal Christ in all sons of God upon earth. The title, Son of God, is a level of attainment, beloved, beyond that of child of God. Therefore I come in this hour to contact those who know you are sons of God, yet who also know that you are not manifesting the fullness of the attainment of the Son of God that you have at inner levels and that you have had in past golden ages. Maitreya teaches 14 mysteries in teachings from the mystery school. Every word matters. He is forthright in explaining the relationship between the teacher in the person of God and the student who arrives with many lifetimes of karmic baggage and misunderstandings from long exposure to worldly teachers. These 14 mysteries are for the serious-minded who realize there is a lesser path of worldly success and the accelerated path of perceptive sensitivity to the teacher's lead. If the goal is the return to the Eedenic consciousness of Christhood, setting aside what was once important to the student in the world and taking up a new set of lifestyle standards applies perpetually to every thought, word, and action. These standards were the acceptable offering, the norm for the 144,000 volunteers so long ago. What was lost can be restored by choosing what you value most and committing to it, knowing you have a personal teacher who is kind, but firm and perpetually committed to you. It's deeply touching to hear helpful tips about the inner retreat from another brother on the path who you might know from history as St. Francis of Assisi. He ascended into his Christhood in the late 19th century and is now known as the Ascended Master Kuthumi. You might think of our elder brother as a highly experienced and capable teaching assistant at the ascended level, a world teacher. Kuthumi says, thus, I come, the joyful student, to announce to you the most precious dispensation which comes from Maitreya, placed upon me by him with all diligence, and the same concern for the step-up of your lives. This dispensation is my assignment to work with each one of you individually for your physical health and for the healing of your psychology, that we might swiftly get to the very cause and core of physical as well as spiritual and emotional conditions, that there be no more setbacks or indulgences, and surely not 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Kuthumi encourages us to pray to him as an ascended master on call, ready to attend to these inner adjustments with kindness. He says, for you are so sincere, and the sweetness of thy hearts is touching to the soul in a world hardened by war and abortion. And then he addresses the alchemy of transmutation always underway at some inner level in the mystery school. He says, this is a school truly of hard knocks. This is a school where you will hear our gruff voice. Be of good cheer, for our bark is often worse than our bite, but proves most useful in eliminating those who are so easily scared away from the fount, who seek favoritism and praise, when in fact they should recognize the love of the gruff voice and know that that which is offended is the ego self, the prideful self. How then does a student in the mystery school, whether physically at the inner retreat or upholding the inner attunement to Maitreya anywhere in the world, replicate the standards of heaven as Jesus did with Maitreya? The answer is in meditating on the same concept that brought Sanat Kumara and the volunteers to Earth in the first place. In Eastern tradition, the concept is known as the Bodhisattva. A Bodhisattva takes a thoughtfully considered vow to set all life free from oppression, to be your brother's keeper, and to stay with Earth's evolutions until all are ascended. This is the same as Sanat Kumara's original plan and vision for Earth, to become an etheric planet again, as it once was. The attitude that a bodhisattva takes in the daily approach to the plan is what Maitreya describes as fearless compassion. Cultivating this outlook takes meditation and practice, and is the reason the mystery school is a place set aside and protected by God for this purpose. Maitreya reminds us that kindness is the key, and that the laughter of God is the consuming of all unrealities. Think about the laughter of God, as in God having the last laugh. Centuries of time and effort by many masters and angels went into the preparation, gathering, and selecting of the pioneers of the new mystery school, including lessons learned from the hard knocks of Eden and the Piscean Age. That effort created a physical platform for the decades of ongoing devotional invocations and decrees from the pioneers. One verse from Revelation explains it all. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto the death. The him they're overcoming is the Luciferian takeover of Earth. The blood of the Lamb is the spiritual essence and sacrifice of Sanat Kumara and the Bodhisattvas in heaven. And the testimony means the invocations of the pioneers who set aside their worldly lives, because this victory is more important than anything in the world. It still is, because the complete victory will eventually arrive along with God's laughter when all of the 144,000 volunteers return and graduate from the new mystery school. Word of mouth will reach each one, and then they will remember they came here to define the golden rule for humanity. When you read teachings from the mystery school, consider finding others of like mind and dedication in your area to talk about it. Layers of new understanding unfold with each rereading, and without even realizing it at first, you may find yourself already a student of Maitreya, wherever you are, by your love of God and your willingness to make those changes that please God. Being an inner student, part of Maitreya's mystery school for Aquarius, means a perpetual curriculum of positive changes under God's guidance. There's a difference between the repetitious roundabout of worldly effects on your life and the upward spiral of returning to the Eedenic consciousness gently, transmuting layers of old karma and baggage, all of which has to go at some time anyway. You can't take that karma to your ascension. Teachings from the mystery school simply confirms that there's a fast track to becoming karma-free, and that you have reliable friends in high places to help you get there. There are moments on this path where you break through an old barrier of anxiety, fear, or resentment into a sudden sense of relief, freedom, and gratitude. And you savor those amazing moments of a peace that passes understanding. Savor them. You take a breath, and then, being brave, you commit to breaking through the next self-imposed barrier and the next. Others have reached the goal of Christhood before you. You can do it too. You can find the books we looked at: Kabbalah, Return to the Mystery School, and Teachings from the Mystery School at summitlighthouse.org/store/books. Please join us next for episode 3 of Light over Lemuria, where we explore another mystery, the voluminous evidence that Jesus has lots to teach us at the beginning of Aquarius. You can also visit Jesus' retreat in the etheric over Arabia at night while your physical body sleeps. Come with us in episode 2 of Touring Heaven on any audio podcast hub, or go to ascendedmasterspiritualretreats.org. And you can also visit Maitriya's retreat in the etheric over Tianjin, China, and in the Himalayas in episode 14 of Touring Heaven. Thank you for spending time with me here on a beach near where the original Eden was, hearing all this history, taking notes on these great books, and wondering what it means to be alive on Earth at this time when the tide of civilization is gradually turning towards a golden age, perpetually self-transcending.